I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I add to the thanks that the opposition gives to the Minister for bringing forward this piece of legislation, which, as other speakers have noted, gives effect to New Zealand's obligations and to the arising from the 2005 changes to the international protocol relating to laws of the sea relating to maritime terrorism. Mr Speaker, and ministers do good things as well as bad things. The last speaker said that we should be proud of the government's work in the Middle East through the New Zealand's armed forces doing work there, and I'm sure all people in New Zealand are supportive of the armed services when they're sent overseas and told to do what the government says they should do. It's a wee bit superficial to say, to let that stand without recounting what has led to the terrible state of affairs that we now have in the Middle East. It's interesting that in the next few days we're going to see the Chilcot report come out in the United Kingdom, which considers whether the Parliament there was misled by their then politicians who took them into the war in Iraq when the United Nations refused to endorse an invasion of Iraq because Hans Blix, on behalf of the United Nations, had spent some months ferreting around Iraq and had concluded that there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction which were used as the excuse to invade Iraq. And I was a junior backbench in this Parliament in the then Labour government when the New Zealand Labour Party kept New Zealand out of the war of Iraq, and I would like to pay my tributes to the three people who led New Zealand in that regard at that time, who were Helen Clark, Michael Cullen and Phil Goff. All of those people withstood enormous pressure from the then opposition National Party, as well as pressure from our traditional allies, Australia, United Kingdom and the United States. And I can remember sitting in the back benches over the 6-week period when this was unfolding, watching the leaders of my party go grey. The pressure was intense. I remember the stress that they were under as they took that decision for New Zealand and withheld enormous pressure from our traditional allies and from the intemperate comments that came from the National Party, who said we should be in that. Well, Mr Speaker, the other parties have said that this is another example of us doing our duty in respect of terrorism, and I'm recounting how some of the things that have gone wrong in the world, backed by the National Party, have made terrorism worse, including maritime terrorism. Now, my leaders of that party, Phil Goff, Annette, Helen Clark and Michael Cullen, they bounced back from that stress. They did bounce back from that stress, but I challenge any one of the members of Parliament who were here then not to agree with me that the pressure was enormous, and the leaders of the Labour Party showed true leadership at that time by refusing to make the world's problems with terrorism worse with an illegal invasion of Iraq. Now, those things are still dogging us in the world, including in the field of marine terrorism, because the consequences of that terrible decision that was made by other countries, including Australia, United Kingdom and the United States, are still with us. Iraq, of course, has not seen a moment's peace since those days. We have terrorist atrocities becoming worse in Iraq. Everyone knows that Saddam Hussein was a terrible leader, but what we have unleashed in the world since has flowed outside of the Iraqi borders and inflicts countries as not just Iraq. It's interesting that we see international reports that some of the leaders of ISIL are actually former Iraqi military personnel and intelligence personnel who've just found another outlet for their evil ways, Mr Speaker. Can I refer also, sir, to another aspect where the reputation of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been undermined, and that's the matter that was touched on by David Shearer relating to the accusing of Mr Lesk and Mr Fife as being sources of leaks from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The Rebstock inquiry was...
Point of order. The member is now 5 minutes into his 10-minute speech and hasn't mentioned a single clause in the bill, and he needs to do that. I accept that the previous speaker from both sides of the House made a aside in respect of other matters that were outside the bill, and I let that go. I note that the National Party member only spoke for 3 minutes, and Mr Shearer's points were sideways. But I think the member now who has the floor needs to start talking about what's in the bill. This is a first reading on the Maritime Crimes Bill.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, as other speakers have said, this legislation does introduce new offences that relate to maritime terrorism, including maritime terrorism itself, illicit trafficking by ships of weapons of mass destruction. You've got to be a bit careful about that around here, because the National Party would be very willing, based on their history, to misrepresent what was proper evidence of weapons of mass destruction so as to justify invasion of countries like Iraq, Mr Speaker, and also introduces offences relating to the transportation of fugitives by ships. We know, sir, that maritime terrorism is relatively low in frequency. It constitutes less than 1% of all terrorist incidents, but none between 1968 and 2007. But nonetheless, we shouldn't be complacent, and I agree we should put in place this legislation pursuant to the convention that we have signed up to, or to the protocol which changes the underlying international convention, sir. But I do make the point, sir, that if you are interested in curbing terrorism and doing your bit internationally, you need to maintain the reputation of your country, including the reputation of your Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and you don't do that any good at all when you undermine that department by wrongly criticising senior officials within it, which is what this government did through the Rebstock inquiry, and it does not reflect well upon Minister Bennett last week in the face of the Ombudsman report saying that Messrs Lesk and Fife had been dealt with unfairly, to say that there were some procedural problems, but not to acknowledge that the Ombudsman found that it wasn't just processes that were wrong. The substantive conclusion that she made was without justification, and so she besmirched the reputation of those New Zealand Foreign Affairs and Trade officials and undermined the reputation of MFAT nationally, internationally, as well as in New Zealand. Mr Speaker, I end by supporting this legislation, but saying if you want to, as the last speaker says, have a reputation as a good global citizen, you should act responsibly as a global citizen. And in the Middle East, the current government hasn't got a good record, whether it was in respect of the Iraq decision or it was in respect of what they've been doing with Saudi sheep on the desert, that they've spent $11.5 million on, including over $1 million flying sheep to this farm in the desert, and a $4 million cash payment to a sheik that doesn't seem to straight
Amendment Bill.
up.
Shane Retty.
Thank you,